Welcome, everybody. We've got about 23 viewing now and expecting just a few more to pop in as we go, but let's get started. My name's Michael Erwin, and I'm happy to welcome you today to this webinar, Choosing an Annual Pledge Campaign Format. And just as a personal note, this is my first ever webinar, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed. Hope everything works. Hope you can hear me. You've probably joined today because you care about your church and you care about your church's ministry, and you're looking for new, fresh ideas about how to inspire generosity among your membership. So if that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place, and we're just about to get started. Before we get to the material today, though, a little bit of housekeeping. I want you to know that this presentation is being recorded, and it will be posted on YouTube as soon as we're done here today. I'll send you a link to the YouTube page, and I'll send you also a copy of my slides if you'd like to have those in the future as well. Also, I want to answer any questions that come to your mind while we're going along here. So I'm using Google Hangouts, but their question and answer function isn't that great. So instead of that, I'm going to ask you to text or email me during this presentation, and I will keep up with those questions and answer them during the Q&A time at the end. You'll see my phone number and my email. They'll be on every slide going through here. So just send me your questions as they come up, and we'll check in with those towards the end of the webinar. Okay, I'm ready to get started. So a little bit about me, who I am and why I'm presenting on this topic. And you can see my bright smiling face there. I'm an ordained minister. I started out in the Presbyterian Church, USA, and then moved to the United Church of Christ about 13 years ago. I've been in ministry now for 21 years, and in 2010, I became the development director of the local Habitat for Humanity affiliate here in Evansville, Indiana. That affiliate builds between 12 and 20 houses every year, and that requires a lot of money to build those houses. So there were a team of 2 of us on Habitat who were totally devoted to fundraising for that ministry. And in the 5-year period I was there, together we raised over $4 million. So while I was doing that, I began to ask myself whether what I was doing in fundraising outside the church could help churches do more ministry as well, if there was anything that we could learn in the church. And that became the founding of Coaching for Generosity. So I still stay grounded. I pastor a small church here in Evansville, Indiana. But in 2013, I started Coaching for Generosity, and I've been consulting with churches around the issues of mission, vision, stewardship, and generosity. So what we do at Coaching for Generosity, we build up churches by guiding annual pledge campaigns, by assisting churches implement year-round generosity programs, by inspiring legacy and planned giving, and by consulting on capital campaigns as well. So that's enough about me. I'd like to begin this webinar with a word of prayer. So if you would join me in prayer. God of grace, God of joy and abundance, and God of compassion and love, you know our every need, even before we speak. We are the sheep of your pasture, and by your leading, we find ourselves near cool, clear water and in lush green pastures. We thank you today that your love covers all our lives and all our endeavors. Amen. Okay, now on to our topic for today. The first thing I want to do today is ground everything that I say today in the context of spirituality and in a basic theology of stewardship and generosity. Churches often come to me because they need help with their bottom line on their budget, but my work actually is not about money. It's about faithfulness and generosity. It's about discipleship. So I want to show you a cartoon that I really love. I'll read the caption for you. Obviously, it's some poor soul who's applying to enter the pearly gates. And you can see St. Peter's response there. Charitable giving isn't the ultimate test of one's humanity, but it gives us some numbers to play with. So I just show that to highlight the fact that the annual pledge campaign is not about money. It's about growing the hearts of generous givers within our congregations and churches. Our goal as a church, our mission, proceeds from the Great Commission to go out into the world, baptizing and teaching, and from the Great Commandment to love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. And so if there's any measure or any metric that we need to focus on, at least in my opinion, it's those. And so when we come to stewardship and generosity, we might be worried and anxious about the church budget, but the ultimate goal in this work is not the budget. This is one of my fundamental beliefs is God will support the church, and God doesn't need our money to do that. But what God does need is our hearts. So now, having said that, I do believe our giving is a perfect entree to a more meaningful spirituality. And I think you know this verse, but I'll read it again. And this is from Eugene Peterson's The Message, and I think Gene gets it pretty close on. The place where your treasure is the place you will most want to be and end up being. The reason I think that he got it right in that translation is that our hearts do follow our investments. If you go to the track and you put $2 down on number 5 in the 7th race, any of you who have done that before, you'll know you follow that horse from the starting gate all the way around to the finish line as it races around the track. And I've never done this before, but I'm just imagining that if you put $2,000 down on that same horse, you're going to follow it even more closely. And so it's true that wherever we put our treasure, that's where our heart is going to go. And that's why this work of stewardship and generosity is so important. I've seen lives transformed because they took that first step towards sacrificial giving. And I've seen tears in people's eyes as they told me how they came to make a decision in their house to be tithers. Billy Graham was famous for saying the last thing between Jesus and someone's heart is their wallet. So this is important work we're doing, and I hope you'll hear the rest of this information that I'm giving as not so much about the money, but about the hearts of the people who are in our pews and in our small groups and who are touched by our ministries and who help to fund our ministries. So, okay. All right, that's the soapbox. I'm going to get off the soapbox, get out of the pulpit, and get down to the nitty-gritty. Already, I've got a couple of questions lighting up here, so that's good. Encourage you to send more questions, text or email. Love to have those. And I'll answer them. Let's see if I answer them as I go. And if not, I'll come back around at the end, make sure I cover them. So, now when it comes to the annual campaign, you really have 3 basic choices of formats. And within these, there's some nuances and alternatives, but you're going to do one of these or some hybrid approach, some mixed approach of 2 or more of these. And I've listed these in order of effectiveness from top to bottom. So you see at the top is personal contacts, and this can mean something like an every member visitation, or some version of or variation of that. I've seen things sold, things sold under names like Pony Express. It could even mean a telephone campaign. It's that one-on-one personal contact. The key here is that every household is contacted on a very individual basis personally and given an opportunity to make a pledge. The next up from that is the small group format, and I'll go into that in a little more detail later, but essentially this is small groups of maybe 6 to 12. They meet usually in a member's home, and they're presented with information to help them grow in their generosity. And then last, but certainly not least, there are the more general congregational appeals. I think a lot of us are familiar with some form of these, with letters written to all the church members. Maybe you have lay speakers in worship and in Sunday school classes that all lead up to a special worship service, or maybe a nice dinner as well. So these are your three basic formats, and we'll get into the details on each one of them. But before we go there are some components that should be a part of any of these campaigns. And I want to take just a moment to look at some of the essentials that you have to have in place for good planning and good to encourage stewardship. And I'll send this slide out. I won't go into detail on all of these, but I do want you to keep this list in mind. So first of all, planning and leadership are so key to your success. And I encourage you to have generous people in leadership on your generosity work. People who are still taking baby steps when it comes to giving are just not the ones to inspire congregations to be more generous. And mainly that's because, as I mentioned, this is spiritual work we're doing here, and integrity in this area of being a Christian is crucial. Another one I want to highlight is be sure to include children and youth. I mean, we're passing this faith on to them, and this is a huge component of our faith. And so if your congregation has youth or has children, that's your charge. Teach children to give. There are resources out there designed for that. I can connect you with those resources. Ask your teenagers to pledge. They have some disposable income. If you're a church that does confirmation, then this is a good time to begin to teach our teenagers to pledge and make that spiritual commitment. Another thing is to include a challenge as part of the campaign. We're asking people to grow, and to grow in this area of their faith. So ask them to grow. Herb Miller, maybe you've heard of Herb Miller and his new consecration Sunday. He says, step up one. Or you can ask people to grow a percentage of giving each year if you've already taught percentage giving. But whatever it is, be sure to include a challenge within your pledge campaign. The truth is, none of us have really arrived in this area, or maybe any area of our Christian walk. We're not complete yet. And even tithers will be inspired to grow in this area of their faith and to consider what we might call second mile giving. So those are some components and others there that are essential to all campaigns and will be a part of just about any of the three basic types of campaigns that you choose. So on to some specifics in the three types of campaigns, starting with these pledge campaign styles that I call the congregational appeals. So let me know if you've ever done this. My guess is you probably have. First, you set a date for your main event. Maybe it's a pledge Sunday or consecration Sunday, commitment Sunday. And then you look at your calendar and you count back 3 or 4 weeks. And for each of those Sundays, you have a layperson speak to some issue about giving. And then on your Pledge Sunday, people are given pledge cards, which they either put them in the offering plate or they bring to the front during the worship service as part of a special commitment service. A lot of us have done that format of pledge campaign. Another alternative to this is the congregational dinner, in which a special dinner is prepared, maybe even in a special place, a special venue away from the church. Everyone is invited, RSVPs are collected, an inspiring speaker delivers a prepared speech or statement about giving at some point during the dinner, and then pledge cards are handed out and either completed right there on the spot, or people are asked to bring them back to a special Sunday worship service. So maybe you've done something like that before. So I think many of us understand that type of approach. A step up from that, and something that I recommend to probably the majority of my clients, at least right out of the gate, is Herb Miller's New Consecration Sunday. And I don't make any money off of Herb's books. He ought to call me for as much as I promote his books, but he hasn't yet. But a key difference for this approach, rather than what I call consecration light, is that you're going to recruit a guest steward, someone from outside your congregation, to lead your stewardship committee in the planning. And this guest steward will visit your church 3 different times. One, about 6 weeks before Consecration Sunday for the initial planning meeting. And then again, 1 week before Consecration Sunday at a special dinner for leadership. And then the third time they'll visit is on the actual day. And on the Consecration Sunday, the guest steward will preach, and then at the end of the service will lead the congregation in making their pledge commitments. And then following that, and I think this is important as well, a catered celebration meal is shared by the church immediately after the worship service. Another key difference with Herb Miller's process, and it might be the most important one, and this is going back to the spirituality and the theology, but at no time is anyone ever asked to support the church budget with their pledge. Instead, the focus is on the need of the giver to give, on us, what our needs are to be generous givers. And asking the question, how much will I give in thanksgiving and gratitude to God? So even the speakers who are lined up for the Sundays preceding are coached to talk about what it means to give from a spiritual perspective and not from the perspective of the needs of the church. The reason I've seen a lot of churches who do what I call consecration light, and they've gone at my encouragement to New Consecration Sunday and follow that plan to the letter, or at least as closely as they possibly can. And I've seen a lot of success there. And so that might be one step you might want to make this year. The success of going from a basic pledge program to go whole hog onto Consecration Sunday, I've seen 10 to 20% increase in giving the first year that Herb's program was implemented. And that's why I'm such a fan of it, because I think it really does encourage generosity in the right direction towards our response to God's grace. There are some drawbacks to all of these wide congregational appeal models. Chief among the drawbacks is that there is very limited opportunity for dialogue about the mission and vision of the church. With a congregational dinner, that can allow for some dialogue among people at their table, but again, it's very limited. And another drawback is that these models rely on near 100% attendance and participation at that one main event. And if not, then some extensive follow-up afterwards. So each of these models have pluses and minuses, and we'll go through each one of them. So now we'll move on to the small group formats. And here we do get an opportunity for dialogue, and pretty significant dialogue. So small group format, this plan involves enlisting members to attend a meeting in someone else's home, maybe at the church parlor, but preferably in someone's home. And at each one of the small group gatherings, a trained team of leaders make a presentation that highlights the program of the church or speaks about giving. And this allows for dialogue, it allows for discussion, it creates a high level of interest among those who are there. And you get the added bonus that it strengthens fellowship among the members along the way. Commitments can be made at the end of the meeting, but more often than not, pledge cards are passed out after the discussion and presentation, and participants are encouraged to bring those back to a Sunday worship service, hopefully the very next Sunday. These are called cottage meetings sometimes, and I find them pretty helpful when the church is looking to expand its ministry into new areas in the next year, in the near future, in the next year, because these cottage meetings can be used to describe those plans, and even better, they can be used to get feedback about the proposed new ministries. And that really coincides with an old fundraising adage I learned when I was at Habitat, and that is that if you want advice, ask your folks for money. They'll be glad to give you advice instead. But if you want money, ask them for advice. And so this small group models can be used within a strategic planning initiative or as the capstone as you're beginning to roll out a new plan. When you want to share that new or renewed direction within the congregation, it really lends itself to that communication of that new information. The thing is that cottage meetings take work. You need some strong organizers on your team. You need people who can coordinate lots of moving parts. You need hosts who will be trained. You need speakers who will be trained. You'll have to have telephone calls perhaps to remind people of their assigned time and location. And you're also limited to the people who will actually make the effort to attend. And let's face it, in most churches, there's going to be some percentage, and it could be small or it could be large, but it's some percentage who either will not make the effort or cannot make the effort. And so if your goal is that every member be contacted, you'll have to choose either the congregational appeal format or the personal contact format, or if you really are excited about the small group format, you'll have to supplement it, the cottage meetings, with some form of communication with those who aren't able to attend one of the small group gatherings. Last on the list is personal visits, personal contacts, I would say. And this is the most effective way of doing a pledge campaign, just because of the very personal and intimate nature of it. These are also the most time intensive. So in an every member visitation, for example, trained callers visit every household to make a presentation or have a conversation about Christian stewardship, noting the dreams and the goals of the church, or talking about the meaning of giving. And every one of those callers is assigned usually only 4 or 5 families to visit. So if you think about the math on that, if one caller is assigned 5 families or 4 families, that means you're going to need to recruit about 20% of your congregation to be callers. So the strengths of this model are many, and they're very strong. The face-to-face communication and that opportunity for dialogue. Fellowship is strengthened in a very powerful way. Personal growth and stewardship is encouraged, and the positive results of this can be quite significant. And just as with the small group format, the every member visitation affords an opportunity to discuss new directions for the ministry of the church. The format requires a lot of planning and a huge amount of commitment on the part of the leadership, and I think you can see that. Probably the biggest barrier is the difficulty in recruiting that many people in a church who are willing to initiate a discussion about faith and money. Many people are uncomfortable doing that. And last thing I'll say about this before I move on is this is a format that should not be used too often. Maybe once every 5 to 7 years is enough. Maybe if you use it once and there's positive energy that first year, it can be repeated the second year. But as time goes on, people begin to see less and less a need of this really personal, intimate contact year after year after year. So this is something to mix in and then follow up with other types of formats. So I want to stop for just a few minutes. There's a couple of questions that have come in, and just want to make sure that I get a chance to ask those, answer those. First one, is there really any value in doing a pledge campaign at all? We haven't done one in years, and our people really don't want to be bothered, okay? So, short answer to that is yes, there is value in doing a pledge campaign. The one way that we can encourage people to grow in this area of discipleship is that we have to ask them, we have to challenge them, and we have to just put the expectation out that this is an area of faith in which we need to grow. So Dr. Christian Smith is out of Valparaiso University in northern Indiana. He does a lot of research on generosity, and he wrote a book several years ago now called The Paradox of Generosity, and he did research on people who are givers and came up with a lot of great insight. But one of those, by the way, is that generous people are also the happiest people, and that's a wonderful thing to know. But another thing he found was that the most generous people had this pattern to their giving, and he described it in quite a bit of detail. But essentially, they spent an amount of time thinking about what amount and to what cause they wanted to give, and they put a lot of intention and effort into making that choice. And then after the decision was made, they put in place an automatic way of giving so that it became a habit, became habitual and almost thoughtless. So they put a lot of thought in on the front end, but then made the giving automatic. Well, that sounds like an annual pledge campaign to me. And he found that the people who gave the most and were the happiest followed that pattern. So an annual pledge campaign, once a year, you spend time thinking about your response to God's goodness and God's grace, and then you set it on automatic. And with electronic giving options today, you can really set it on automatic. So yeah, I think there's value in doing a pledge campaign. I haven't run across a church that is encouraging generosity effectively that doesn't have a pledge campaign on an annual basis. And in fact, I do run across churches that haven't done a pledge campaign in quite a while, and they are suffering the effects of that spiritually, but also fiscally. The bottom line is hurting. So that's a good question. Thanks for that question. There's another question about telephone campaigns, and okay. Yeah, I think you're right about the telephone campaigns. They're really not suited for a smaller church where everyone knows each other, or even a medium church where it feels almost that way, that everybody knows each other, because especially in a small church, that's kind of off-putting and kind of impersonal. It's almost like the telethon type situation. So in a small church or a medium church, if you're looking for that more intimate contact, skip the phone and go the extra step and look at a small group format or the every member visit if you haven't done that in a while. And yeah, I agree with you. And that's why I didn't mention too much about telephone campaigns. I think only in a larger church, especially in an urban area, and maybe even only as a component of some other type of campaign, would you want to really use the phone to ask people to make a pledge. You might use the phone to ask people to RSVP to a dinner or to, to what have you, or to remind them of a small group meeting, but probably not to ask them to make a pledge commitment. So next question, what about the Pony Express? Has anybody ever done the Pony Express? If you haven't done it, let me tell you what the Pony Express is. It's a model, or I might even say it was a model. I just don't see it happening very often now. But in this, you would put every household on one of several lists. Let's say you have 5 to 8 households on a list, and the person at the top of the list receives the stewardship package first. And this stewardship package has campaign materials and also pledge cards. And the idea is that the person at the top of the list gets the package, reads the materials, completes their pledge, and then passes that package on to the next person on the list. They either take it to their house or drop it in the mailbox, or maybe hand it off in church. And then that next person on the list does the same thing, reads through the materials, completes the pledge card, and then goes on to the next until the very last person on the list makes their pledge and then returns the entire package to the church. And the thing about that is that it never really worked well. And I think part of that is because even in the old days, I had this experience as a child in the 70s with my home church. A couple of years they did the Pony Express. And even then, people got busy, the chain got broken, there had to be phone calls made to remind people to keep things going, to track down where is that package at this point. And I think life has just gotten busier for most of us, and so the Pony Express is probably unsustainable in most churches. So now, if you feel like your church has energy for it, if your leadership's behind it, I'd say go for it. It's fun. There's a lot of corny, quirky jokes you can make about being on the Pony Express. But you might also consider a small group format, and flip that idea of the Pony Express on its head and maybe call it a post office campaign. I'm reminded of a church that I served in very southwestern Georgia, in a very small town, that at 10 a.m. every morning at the post office, everybody in town went to check their P.O. box, and the post office served coffee even, and it was the place where gossip was shared, and the latest news about what was happening in town was shared there at the post office. So maybe you can have a post office campaign where groups come to that one spot, the post office, and it's probably somebody's home, but they come there to get the latest news about the church, and then are encouraged to pledge. So, but if you got energy for Pony Express, go for it, and also send me an email and let me know how it's going. I'd love to hear about that. So, thanks for asking that question. All right. I think that covers all the questions. Let me check my cell phone on the text right now. So one more question here just came in. Is it best to send out a narrative budget with the annual pledge letter versus sending an actual budget in the letter? So I would say best practice. I know churches have habits that they follow, and people feel like they need to continue to follow those habits. But I would say best practice on encouraging and teaching generosity and stewardship is to leave the budget alone and not communicate the budget until after the pledge campaign. And the reason I say that is that it gets to, I would rather not ask our members to pledge in order to support a budget. And sending the budget out ahead of time gives that perception that we're asking you to pledge to support this budget. I would rather that you ask them to give generously and to make a pledge commitment because of the more spiritual reasons of our response to God's grace and what God is calling us to do. Giving to a budget is a transaction. I will give this money, it will support this budget, and the services will be there. And what I'm really after is giving that is transformational, that is transforming the heart of the giver. So on the narrative budget, I would say I love narrative budgets. I think the appropriate time for that is either long before the pledge campaign or long after the pledge campaign, as you're getting ready for the next year to describe how the budget is going. So, hey, somebody's getting me on both sides here. They're telling me to check my email. And I am checking my email. That's great. So how do we make a distinction between generosity in general and generosity expressed within one's congregation? My folks are generous overall, but are spreading this out over lots of worthy organizations. Okay, thanks for sending that, Karen. So that's a tough one. What I do think it's important for us as church leaders is to teach tithing. I didn't really emphasize that, but I do believe in it, not because it's a legalistic rules way of earning God's grace or anything like that, but only because I've never, if you ask your people who are tithers why they tithe, they've never said because of any legal reason that the Bible asks them to. It's almost always a spiritual reason. And they'll talk about, almost with tears in their eyes, about how they came to that decision and how even in the hard times they've been able to continue that commitment even when the money wasn't there, and what that's meant to them as a response to God's grace and how they came to that place. Now, that doesn't really answer your question directly, except that sometimes that's where we get into the conversation about, okay, we're generous in this place, and maybe we're not as generous in the church. You can look at a tithe in a number of different ways. Some people will say, 10% to your church and give beyond that. Some people will say, well, I'm going to split my tithe between my church and the other causes that I care about. I think for most of us who are in the mainline church, we see the value of continuing the Christian faith. We also see the value of expressing our own faith through these other organizations that we support or individuals that we support who are in need. And so I would lift up and encourage all of that as much as possible. And so while there may be a distinction, I would just challenge our members to grow in their generosity, whichever direction that they feel God is calling them to grow in that generosity. It will transform them and just not leave them alone. So that may not be a full answer, but I think we have to stay away from the legalistic ideas and get more to God loves a cheerful giver, to give not under compulsion, and to really ground it in our response to God's grace, whether it's giving to the church or whether it's giving beyond the church as well. So come back at me with your opinion on that. I'd love to have more conversation about that, though, because it is a tough question. So thanks. Another question: can a family-sized church create a prayer time during the week or during the worship service for the sole purpose of fervent praying over and around the theme of growing a person or a family's generosity? If it is a matter of spirituality, can generosity become as common as praying? I do like the way you asked the last part of that question. If it's a matter of spirituality, can generosity become as common as praying? It absolutely should. We should be generous every moment of our lives, and as common as praying. So can a family-sized church create a prayer time during the week for the sole purpose of praying over around the theme of growing in generosity. It's possible. I'd like to see it. I also have a suspicion that people might not continue to attend after a while, but yes, I haven't really seen that before. I'd love to see how it would be played out. So thanks for asking that question. Okay, one more check on the email just to make sure. And that looks like that answers all the questions. So I want to wrap this up. I hope it's been good information for you. The last thing I want us to consider is just a little bit of thought about, having heard all of this information, what's right for your church this year? And the answer is that depends. I think each of these formats can find a home in a great many churches. Maybe even the Pony Express can, who knows? So, but here's some things I would consider. Recent campaigns. What's your history on campaigns? I mentioned if you've done a every member visit last year, maybe 2 years in a row now, it might be time to move on. Check with your leadership to see what they think about that. If you've been stuck in that Sunday morning dedication pattern, that consecration light, consider moving up to full-blown new consecration Sunday with Herb Miller, or mix it up from year to year. One rule of thumb is to stick with one style for 2 or 3 years and then switch it up, and maybe pull in a small group 1 year, or do that 2 years in a row. But what's your history on recent campaigns? What about your financial needs? Do you want to add staff? Do you want to add programs? Is that part of the vision for the near-term future next year? So you might consider, if that's the case, to use that small group format or the every member visit format. Do you have a significant number of active people who are not pledging and maybe not even giving in any way whatsoever? And every member visit could help with that. In fact, I talked with a church last night that is in that situation where there's people who are actively opposed to pledging, and so they're considering an every member visit campaign to help communicate the importance of pledging. So, leadership. This may be a key question. Are your leaders willing to help, and to what extent and what format would they support? Do you already have stewardship education? Are you communicating about mission and vision already year-round? Or do you need to include that explicitly in the campaign? How much time do you have to plan? If you're listening today, it's April 19th. You probably have time to plan any of these. But if you're catching this later in the year on YouTube and it's August or September, you may need to pick out something quick and easy, like some of the congregational appeals. Stewardship. Do you want to focus on this spiritual aspect of giving that I've been really promoting today? And of course, you know where my heart is that I really hope you do. What about your pastor? Is your pastor comfortable speaking from the pulpit on stewardship of financial resources? And then finally, the ethos and mood, which really ties all these ideas together. And do you need an opportunity for dialogue at this stage of the congregation's life? Is there a high level of confidence and trust between the staff and the members? Is there a positive sense of achievement to build on this year? Or are there other reasons that you might need dialogue, or might want to stay away from dialogue? So, and to take all of these concerns together and really come up with perhaps which format would fit better for you this year. But I did want this webinar to be in April, after Easter, but before summer, so that it will give you plenty of time to choose a format and move forward and begin planning the one that would be best for your church. So I'm going to help you you want some help with some of those questions and you're in the webinar, you're listening after the fact, I've got a questionnaire, and I'll send this out to everybody so you don't have to write it down. But this questionnaire to probably take you less than 10 minutes, but and we'll ask questions about where your congregation is on these issues. And the way the survey works is you fill it out and it sends me an email with your responses, and then I'll get back to you personally with some suggestions for a couple of models and even some resources to help you get started. So I'll email this out after the webinar is over. And so there you go. So last check. Looks like I've answered all the questions. Oh, there's one more. Okay. Yes, small groups. I think I answered the one about small groups, what that format would be for that. But if you need more clarification on small groups, shoot me an email or a text. But essentially, you're going to divide the congregation up into cohorts. You may do that geographically or some other way. You want to keep households together so that all people in the household are going to the same gathering. Just makes it easier. You're going to recruit hosts. Hopefully I've always found that it's nice if they have hors d'oeuvres or a dessert, something, probably not a whole meal. And you're going to want to train a team or 2 teams or 3 teams who present the message and facilitate the conversation. And then you're going to need some follow-up communication just ahead of the small group gatherings to make sure people know when and where they're supposed to be and what the topic is. And so that's going to be mail, email, phone calls, really kind of a get out the vote type situation. So and then you're going to have pledge cards that they can either fill out on the spot, or what I think is better is, hand out the pledge cards and ask them to go home and bring them back the very next Sunday for a special pledge commitment service. So if you have any more questions about that, I'll get you a resource about how to put those small groups on. So, all right. Thank you all. Thanks so much for participating today in my first webinar. And thanks for your dialogue, your great questions, and mostly thank you for caring enough about the church that you take time to join us. If you have any further questions, I'm always just a phone call or a text or an email or a Facebook or a Twitter or a LinkedIn or what have you. There you see it all. It costs you nothing to send me a message, and I'm always willing to help. This is what it's my skill set. It's my passion. I want to build up the church in the way that I can, and this is the way that I can do it. So thanks for checking in, and please be in touch, and blessings, courage, and peace be with all of you in your ministries and in your lives. Have a good day, everybody.